Okay, everyone, it's the top of the hour, and we're going to just get started here in another moment with our live session in the Food Safety Expo. We're going to give everybody another minute or so to assemble, pile in, and begin to join us here for this session. But I wanted to remind you all, as you're out there waiting for us to start, that you're going to have a chance to ask some questions of our panelists. So if you have questions about the food safety standard development process, get them queued up. I'll give you instructions in a moment about how to do that. So we'll just wait another few seconds before we get started to let people continue to assemble in here. So just sit tight for one more second, if you would. All right. Well, I think we're probably at the point where we can get started, and people will continue to trickle in as we go, and we'll welcome them as we do. So welcome to you all who are here now for our first live session at this Expo, Making Your Voice Heard in Food Safety Standard Development. And again, that's the first of 3 live sessions we're going to be having at Exemplar Global's Food Safety Expo 2021. I'm your host, Mike Richmond. Exemplar Global, of course, is excited to take our virtual events to this next level with you. And we're going to do that by delving into relevant topics that really affect you as a food safety management system professional, and allow you to interact directly with our expert panelists, our subject matter experts, in real time. And for this session, we're joined by 2 excellent panelists, Karina Delaguerre and Stephanie Lemaitre. But before I introduce you to Karina and Stephanie, let's quickly set the ground rules so we know how we're doing this. We encourage you, we want you to interact with our panelists. So if you have questions, please text them, write them in the chat box. I'll receive those questions and then I'll pose them to Stephanie and or Karina as we go. You can also note that this session is being recorded. So if you're not able to join us live, if you're watching this on demand, that does not mean you can't ask questions. We encourage you to please ask questions as well. Just email them to my colleague, Jane Bowler, and Jane's email address is jbowler, Jboler, at exemplarglobal.org. So if you send those questions in to Jane, she will then forward them on to Karina and or Stephanie, and we'll write you back with the responses. So without further ado, let's get on to our panelists. Karina Delaguerre is a senior consultant food safety for Danish Standard, where she assists with the development of European and international standards on food safety, microbiology, food authenticity, methods of analysis, and more. She also manages ISO TC 34 SC 17, which is the Food Safety Management System Secretariat responsible for the development of the ISO 22000 family of standards. Karina was previously a food inspector for Danish Food Authority. Stephanie Lemaitre, advance the slide there. Stephanie is the founder of Lean Safe, a consulting company for food business and supply chain quality and safety. She is previously technical director of the certification program owner IFS and the global marketing manager of food certification audit programs with Bureau Veritas Group. Stephanie has been involved in GFSI working groups since 2005, including support of GFSI as a technical writer. She is a GFSI benchmark leader, providing expertise and training for food safety auditors, governance of certification programs, and certification operating models. Karina and Stephanie are going to briefly share a little bit about what they do within the ISO and GFSI worlds and offer some insight into how you as a food safety management system professional can get involved in the process. So Karina, you are up first.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks a lot for having me, for inviting me. As Mike said, I'm a standardization consultant from Danish Standard and the committee manager of TC 34 SC 17, which is Food Safety Management Systems. This is within ISO, and ISO is not-for-profit, located in Geneva, and organized within over 230 technical committees. The members in ISO are represented by over 160 national standardization bodies. You can see some of them on the screen. Mine DS is Danish Standards. The TC of ISO develops standards within various fields, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the Food Safety Management Committee, which is the one that I am responsible for. So, thank you, Mike. The ISO standardization process is always driven by the users of the standard, who acts as the standard developers within different working groups. The process is always consensus-based, which means that the requirements always represent the level that the experts can agree upon. Now, that doesn't make the requirements the world's best or most perfect solution requirements, but we find the level that the experts can agree upon. This is where the consensus comes in. This means that ISO standard always represents the voice of the market. So the next one. This is just to map up the different standardization activities, because other than ISO, we also have the IEC, which is also on the international level and deals with electronics. And you can see on the European level, we have CEN, which is equivalent with ISO, but within Europe. And on the electronical part, we have CEN-ELEC. So this is just to do kind of the mapping. So the next one. So this is about ISO TC34 SC17, terrible name, but it's actually just the Food Safety Management System Standard Committee. And we develop standards within the family of ISO 22000. And you can see the scope on the screen. I think that most of you already knows it. And also you can find our homepage is also on the screen now. And the next one shows you the members of our committee. As you can see, we have a lot. We have about 70 participating members. This means that we actually have over 70 active countries involved in the development of ISO 22000 standards, and also 30 observing members. The difference between the two is that observing members can't vote in the process. And to take the next slide, you can see our current documents that we work with. We have what we call the mother standard, ISO 22000, which is the requirements for all organizations in the food chain. Then we have the ISO 22002 series 1 to 6, which is the prerequisites. This is currently under revision. And then we have ISO 22003, which is requirements for bodies providing audit and certification. And last, we have the traceability standard. So these are just the current documents that we work with. And the next one just shows you how to get involved in standardization. I must underline that standardization is for everyone. And in Denmark, we have a model where we actually help small and less developed businesses to join standardization by giving them a cheaper fee when they join the Mirror committees. So you can find your standardization body by visiting the what's it called, Mike? Thing on the screen.
The website.
The website, right? Sorry. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Karina. That's a good basic overview. We're going to dive deeper into that in a few moments. But before we do that, I want to introduce you to Stephanie and let Stephanie tell you a little bit about her background and the work that she does with GFSI.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be there today with you, and I hope that our speech with Karina and the questions you will get will allow you to have a better understanding on how you can contribute as an auditor in all those standard development. So starting with the landscape, how can certification bodies play a key role in standards development? So of course, Karina mentioned ISO, this is key, and there are many certification bodies who are attending the working groups. And here I will more speak about GFSI, Global Food Safety Initiatives, which is more related to the private certification space. And through the organization, but also through different other organizations, certification bodies have various ways to contribute to standard development. First, there are different associations, certification bodies or inspection bodies organization like IIOC or the TIC Council, where the certification bodies can build specific working groups related to food safety, and they can build a kind of proposals or consensus that they can either share directly with GFSI or with what we call the CPOs. It's not Star Wars space, it's the certification program owners. And on the right side of my slide, I have listed you all the GFSI recognized so-called CPOs. So you can see that there are many. And in the next slide, I'm going to present you how, through GFSI, how you as an auditor and as a certification body, you can contribute. So first, from GFSI point of view, there are two levels where you can contribute. The first one is through the different GFSI working groups, because GFSI regularly is setting up working groups on various topics. So the GFSI board members decide about the areas where specific needs are. So for example, recently there has been a specific working group on leafy green, on pre-harvest of animals. There is one currently running on auditor competencies. And there is also the so-called ZAF, or Stakeholders Advisory Forum. And in each of these groups, there are representatives of all the stakeholders in the food safety space, meaning certification bodies, accreditation bodies, industry representatives, retailers, food service, and so on. And so how can you participate? So for this specific, especially for the technical working groups, usually GFSI is sending what we call a call for participation, and then you need to apply directly, and then GFSI is reviewing applications and select the appropriate members of those working groups. So whatever your background, if you are interested in a specific working group, you can apply through this call for participation. And the second level where auditors and certification bodies could contribute is directly through the different certification program owners, because the governance and the contribution of certification bodies and auditors is a must or a mandate for GFSI to all the certification program owners. Because indeed, in the GFSI rules, there are a lot of requirements that GFSI is asking the CPOs to fulfill when they develop or update a certification program. So firstly, any GFSI recognized standard needs to involve technically competent representatives, meaning that on their own or on the corner of a table, the requirements, they need to involve all representatives, meaning again, certification bodies and industry. Secondly, GFSI asks that all the CPO implements an extensive stakeholder consultation with enough time for review and due consideration to comments received. So some CPOs are running a real public consultation. So probably you have seen that some CPOs have public consultation, and here you can provide direct input, or this will be done through certification bodies or a group of certification bodies. GFSI also asks to ensure that the CPO shall ensure consensus, and they need to demonstrate that through a formalized approval process, meaning that to be a GFSI recognized CPO, the CPO needs to demonstrate that first they have asked for feedback, and second that they have reviewed all their comments to update accordingly the requirements. And last but not least, every GFSI recognized CPO shall ensure that stakeholders can make effective contacts. So usually there are always a generic email address where you can post a question and raise your hand if you have a question or an issue with an interpretation. And here again, how can you participate to this system? First, you can apply to join the CPO committees. Usually, they are made of 2 to 3 certification bodies, but it can change, so you can apply. You can directly and individually provide your feedback during the public consultation phase. You can do that at the CPO level, but also during the official GFSI public consultation, because before any new update or re-benchmarking process of a CPO, there is always a GFSI public consultation phase. And in general, you can always raise your concerns and opportunities for improvements to your certification body, who will report and share it with the CPOs. So that's it for me. So any questions are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll leave that up for another second. Let people jot that down so they can contact you if they have questions. And we'll go back and we'll get to Karina's as well, so you can remember her contact information. So I'm going to stop the share now because we are starting to see a few questions trickle in here and there. But before we get to them, and I want to remind you, of course, if you do have questions, please feel free to share them with us in the chat box using the chat function here in Zoom. And I will then receive those and I will forward them on to Karina and Stephanie live here on the air, and we'll get to them. But before we get to those questions, I actually have one of my own, which I think may address some of the questions that some of the folks out there have. So I'm curious as to your own process. How did you get introduced to standards development? How did you get involved in standards development bodies? I'm just curious as to who brought you in, how you found your way to that. So Stephanie, why don't you start first on this one?
Yes, sure. Well, easy for me because as a technical director for the CPO IFS during 11 years, I was directly involved in standard development and standard updates. And I've been involved in the governance of the different working groups and the boards. And also during those 11 years, I managed 3 review processes of the standards. And believe me, I have, well, good or bad memories. Let's see, about crazy, Excel sheets where we took on board the comments of everyone. But what I can say from my experience is that the contribution of auditor and of certifications is key, because usually the industry is setting up the expectations, but at the end, these are the auditors who are auditing and interpreting and assessing the requirements. And we need their involvement to really have in the standards the practical approach and what we call the auditability of each requirement.
How about you, Karina? How would you answer that question?
Not as good as Stephanie, obviously. Actually, I got into this by coincidence because I used to be a food safety inspector for the Food Administration, which I really loved. And I'm quite operational in my thinking. So I got into this by, just applying for something else. And once I got there and once I got to learn how to sit still on a chair, it took about 2 years, I got to see the value in developing standards in close cooperation with the users, because this really creates value that we kind of walk in the same frame, we talk the same language within the requirements all over the world. And personally, what I'm very focused about is how to develop these documents operational and easy to understand, because my personal view is that this can easily get very academic and very difficult to use. And if you want to embrace the entire world, also less developed countries, you have to be very clear in how you communicate the requirements. And I'm very focused on that. I want this to be easy to use.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because you talk about that from the practical perspective of being on site and looking at that, because auditors, in particular inspectors, auditors, have such an interesting skill set that applies so well. I think sometimes that you mentioned the academic part of that. Sometimes we lose track of the idea that it's got to apply to the users, and the auditors are probably the ones, people that are listening to us now, are probably the ones that have the best perspective on that.
Yeah, and also I think we should also keep in mind that as a practical person like me who really has this operational thinking, you always have to be very pragmatic and always look at the risk. What is the actual risk in this organization? And as an auditor, I think that if you always keep that in mind, it doesn't have to be that complicated. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's very important to try and keep the documents as simple as we possibly can. and still gain consensus among the stakeholders.
And this is, and I want to bring you in on this too, Stephanie. This is it's a technical business, but it's a personal business too. And I think we can never lose sight of the fact that we're working with people. This is a people business. So I'm curious as to people that maybe have been mentors or the mentoring process that either of you may be engaged with. But Stephanie, I particularly want to kind of get your sense of, how people brought you in and how maybe you bring people into this process.
Well, usually, and I think Karina will share that with me. In general, certification bodies and auditors are very willing to support and very pragmatic and have a positive approach. We never or very rarely receive, only complaints. It's always very constructive and suggestion of improvements. And I think a failure would be for any standard, that when an auditor is reading a key element or a requirement, says, sorry, I don't know how to audit that. And as Karina says, it should be simple, it should be risk-based, but again, it's up to either the CPO or the training organization also to give the keys of understanding of the auditors on how to apply that. So training is important, witnessing also or mentoring is key to really guide the auditor on how to interpret and read the requirements. Again, it should be clear and pragmatic, but tools should also be available to support the auditors on this way.
Yep, that's great. I think that's totally, that makes total sense because, interpreting the language, I mean, that's really what these come down to is language and understanding how the language applies to, translating how the language applies to how stakeholders are actually using these standards to improve their systems. I think that's really key. We lose track of that sometimes, that at the end of this machine, there needs to be a process that helps people do their job better, have safer food, have better processes, be more efficient. So I think that's great. I had a question here. A question came in from one of the users. With all these different food safety standards, SQF, FSSC, BRC, et cetera, which, if any, takes precedence? Okay, that's interesting. Karina, what would you say to that one?
What do you think I would say, Mike?
Well, how does ISO integrate that?
Well,
maybe it's a better way of putting it.
To be honest, I don't know, but we are trying, when we create ISO standards and when we develop ISO 22000, we really go very far to try and bridge all the different interests. And we have people in the committee there from FSSC, from IFS, from BRC, but also from Codex and the FDA and other organizations. So actually we are trying to bridge all of these opinions into one standard. ISO 22000 is not GFSI recognized, but this is not our aim. Our aim is to try to bridge as much as the world as we possibly can into one document. And that's really the hard thing about it. But on that note, I actually think that ISO 22000 takes a lot of precedence when the other standards are developed, because we cover the whole world and we try to bridge all the also political issues and governments, and we try to bridge the whole world. So actually, I think it's ISO 22000.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a ground standard. It's a mother standard. It has the basic thinking. It has the risk-based approach, and yeah, I think that's it.
And Stephanie, how would you feel about what Karina is saying there? Would you say that there's some information or some gaps that GFSI can address?
Well, first, obviously, GFSI is working very closely with ISO and especially with the ISO 22003 working group, because ISO has the advantage and the benefits to be, the organization which sets the ground rule, and GFSI cannot ignore it, and it's key. But then to answer your question about taking precedence, I think no certification programs takes precedence because there is a demand and a market for all of them. Because here we are talking about food safety and management system, but the certification programs sometimes not only address management systems, but also many good manufacturing practices, good hygiene practices. Some are dealing with food safety only, others are dealing with quality and food safety. Some are more focused for industry, others for private labels. So again, there is space for all of them, and sometimes I think competition is good because it's allowing continuous improvements, and it's pushing every certification program to get improved and not sitting in their comfort zone and just doing nothing. So I think it's good for always trying to be open to any new emerging topic.
Now, GFSI, and I want to make sure I understand this properly too. You two are the experts. So GFSI is a scheme and not a standard. Is that correct? Am I stating that properly? Or
not exactly. It's
okay.
an organization, and they are not providing certifications themselves. It's an organization from the Consumer Goods Forum, and they play a key role in harmonizing and recognizing the different certification programs. So they don't certify, but they really try to promote what they call once certified, recognized everywhere, meaning that they are setting the baseline that each certification programs needs to fulfill. And of course, the certification program are free to include more requirements, but they are setting a common baseline on food safety. And once the certification program is GFSI recognized, then we try to promote the once certified, recognized everywhere globally.
Got it. I had another question here. Oh, and before I jump into this next question, we're about halfway through our session right now. There's still time, of course, for you to get your questions in. If you want to use the chat function on your screen, you can submit questions to us. We're starting to get a few rolling in now pretty well. So if you do have more questions, please just send them in, because what happens at these sessions, many of you have attended these, people generally tend to send all their questions in the last 5 minutes, and I end up with a bunch of questions I can't get to. So don't wait. If you have a question you'd like to ask our panelists about either GFSI or ISO or just food safety standards or schemes in particular, please just submit them to us now. So we had an interesting question. Let me make sure I'm just reading this now. Let me make sure I can phrase this properly. This is about two things. It's really about accommodating technologies and remote auditing being acceptable in terms of these either GFSI and or ISO. So Karina, why don't I ask you that firstly? Does ISO 22000 accommodate, say, technologies like remote auditing or Google Glass or some of these other technologies that auditors and auditees may want to utilize for remote auditing in this COVID world that we're in?
I think FSSC does. FSSC 22000, they have some of the audits done remotely, but there are some rules for the auditors if they do it. For instance, in Denmark, they should have visited the business already once before they can do a remote audit. We are starting to discuss remote audits in the committee, but we haven't got to the place where we kind of set the rules for it yet. I think we have to adapt very quickly now, also because of the pandemic. And I think it can be done, at least some of the audit can be done that way. But I don't know, what do you say, Stephanie, about this? I think this is more like your field.
Yes, I can confirm that at least from the accreditation forum, IAF, they have released a document allowing the performance of remote auditing by using information and communication technologies. And this is ruled by AAF, and this is also ruled by GFSI. And as you said correctly, all the standards are allowed to perform remote auditing, but they need to have a kind of split audit, having a documentation check, which is allowed to be performed remotely, but they need to have at least a piece of the audit to be performed on site.
Yeah, and that's the challenge because food safety, of course, is such a wide variety of types of organizations. I mean, you're talking about, farms, obviously, and restaurants and processing plants and slaughterhouses, and there's so many different types of organizations, and the technology, the way that you would bring an auditor's eyes and ears to a process, to a plant, to a floor, to a field is going to be different in all different types of sectors, right? Am I correct in that?
Yeah, you are. And especially when you talk about cleaning,
Yeah.
it's very, very, very difficult to do the remote audit. I mean, how can you see the dirt through those Google glasses? So, but I know there's a lot of requirements that you can actually do remotely, but still there are some challenges still. And I think that once the technologies gets to the next level, that the equipment gets better, and I think that we will get there somehow, or at least soon, because we have to adapt to this new situation very quickly. But there are challenges.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there is the document. What both of you mentioned is that documentation piece is the easy piece. I mean, obviously, you can have somebody send an auditee can send to the auditor the documentation, and that auditor can review it and then can certainly ask questions, just like we're talking now, very easily. You don't need to be on site to do that. But yes, when you're in a process where cleanliness is so critical, it's not a small consideration to be able to understand what's really going on in that on site at that place.
Yeah, and also the behavior, I would say, we are more and more talking about food safety culture and how can you measure food safety culture remotely. So it's true that nothing can replace a live and a real meeting, but I'm sure that the technologies will improve, but it needs to be very reliable to allow proper auditing, because as you said, Karina, we need also to be agile, and regarding the context, we still have, as a matter of business continuity, we need to implement measures to still audit and control and measuring the risks at the company. And another important topic is about auditor capacity. We know that certification bodies are suffering from auditor capacities, and with the extending number of certified companies globally and all the challenges of qualifications, languages, etc., we need to find solutions to allow every companies to be audited.
Something you said there, which was a phrase that I wanted to cover, so I'm glad you did it for me, is culture. Culture is so important in any standard inspection procedure, auditing procedure, because it's culture in two ways. Obviously, it's culture for the organizational culture of how they deal with their processes, their issues, their problems, but it's also an international culture. There's different ways that different organizations in different countries, nations around the world, do things. Now, I know we want to try to standardize, but there are also cultural issues that I think, and maybe you can address this, Karina, that the consensus process is intended, I think, to kind of smooth those things out a bit when standards are developed.
Yeah, and also like finding what is the high level of the consensus, really, because it's very, very difficult to bridge cultures all over the world. Like, for instance, we can't even agree on what's a food. We can't even agree on which animals do we eat and which animals do we pet.
Right.
So on that note, it just gives you a clue about how difficult it is about cultures, also about food waste, about reuse. It's very controlled by culture in the different countries. So this is an area where we probably can't bridge it 100%, but we can find some kind of high level, some kind of consensus that we can agree upon. And on top of that, we can have our own national cultures as we want, of course, adaptable to the national legislation and so on. So it's very difficult to bridge cultures.
Yeah, and I think that's just part of the work is standardization is important. I mean, I think that we need to recognize we are all one world, especially in food, which is oftentimes shipped all over the world. Obviously, I go to my supermarket and I see food from literally all over the world, produce. And I was wondering, like, wow, how could they ship that, thousands of miles? But, the processes need to be so that that food is safe as it's going through that process. All right, I have another question here from one of our viewers. And again, I'm going to continue to remind folks because we're going to run out of time, but definitely get your questions in using the chat function, the chat box, if you want to ask some questions of Karina and Stephanie. We're going to terminate the session at the top of the hour. All right. Can your standards be integrated with other standards, such as those for quality, environmental, and OH&S? Can they be audited together? So I think what the question is really talking about is integration. And I think I want to go back to you for that, Karina, because I think you have a good perspective on that. So how would you, or how would an auditor or an auditee look at 22,000, 9,001, 45,001, and what have you? How would they look at those standards together?
The beauty of ISO management system standards is that they're all written in the same structure. It's all developed within what we call high-level structure. Mm-hmm. This means that most of the requirements are actually the same. And when you get to the operational part, it changes. That means that the auditor can actually do just one audit and then change for the operational part. It's not quite as simple as it sounds, but the idea is to get businesses who needs more than one management system standards a little to make it a little bit easier for them, and especially for the auditor. But ISO 22000 is written in high-level structure and is integrated with other ISO management standards like quality, environmental, occupational health, and so on.
And Stephanie, I know obviously it's not a fair comparison, but can you weigh in a little bit about how people would work within GSI in terms of integrating other systems and other types of audits that one may need to do?
Well, I would say it's much more complex than it would be with ISO, because currently there is no other global organization, dealing with the different sectors. So, for example, GFSI, they have an initiative related to environment, but they don't have this equivalent initiatives, on harmonizing and benchmarking. So I know that the different certification program owners, so for example, Global Gap, they do have standards related to environment and sustainability, but right now there is no harmonization process in this area.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And what, I want to turn back to the question of how people would get involved, because I think this is really the kind of the key thing here. And this is my own question. So let's say that I'm a food safety auditor. I have clients that I audit to in various sectors and schemes and standards, and I have experience working in the field. What would I do? I mean, what would be, and I know we talked about it a little bit in the PowerPoint, but Stephanie, I'll kind of turn to you for this. What would be really the best way to begin to get involved, to make my voice heard, as we say?
I think the first step will be to share this feedback with their certification bodies, because the certification bodies is the appropriate window, I would say, to share with certification program owners. Of course, they can directly address their questions to the CPOs, but I mean, the CPOs cannot afford, to receive every individual questions of every auditors. But I would recommend the first step would be to raise their hands to their certification bodies, and usually the certification bodies are consolidating all the feedbacks from auditors and then share them with the certification program owners or the other organizations. And when there is a repetition of finding, or when there is something very critical, obviously then the CPO are making changes in their standards.
Karina, what would you say to that?
For standardization, I'm not quite sure that it's the same in all countries, but in most countries, it works that way, that within all fields within ISO, the national standardization bodies create mirror committees nationally. If there is a national interest, like for instance in Denmark, we have a very strong interest in food, toys, medical devices, but we're not that interested in gold, but other countries might be. So for gold, we don't have a mirror committee, but for the other things, because we have a national interest, we create what we call a mirror committee. And there we have national stakeholders where they sit and have agree on their consensus level before we draw it into the international level. Within ISO, you don't need to apply, you don't need qualification, it's for everyone. The standards even have a public hearing where you and me, as just normal people from the street, can actually comment on the standards, and then the comments will be sent to the mirror committee, which will consolidate the comments, and they will be built into the international work. So this is basically for everyone, and then you pay a fee to be part of the national mirror committee, and the fee in Denmark, it is cheaper for small companies and educations and others to be in the committee than it is for the big companies. So we actually help the little ones to get some influence into this market, because we know that if they can grow and export their food, we can have growth in the society, and that's basically what Danish Standards does. We only get ourselves into subtopics that has a national interest.
So as an American as I am, I would contact ANSI, I guess. That would be
right.
And
I know for America, it's organized a little differently, because it's not only ANSI that's the national standardization body. I know that there are also others, but ANSI is the way in the way to enter the standardization world, and then you will probably be directed to some other organization which deals with windmills or food or what it might be.
And for you, it would be Danish Standard, as you mentioned.
Right.
Right. Got it. Interesting. Okay, good. Because yeah, like I mentioned, and we were talking about is that, you know, my thought is that the auditors, I think the people listening to this are the ones that have that knowledge, that practical knowledge of what's going on. And as a matter of fact, I just got a question here, interesting one. I'll ask this of you, Stephanie. So I don't know, maybe you know this. What percentage of auditors or former auditors or current auditors are involved in GFSI or ISO, as the case may be for Karina? So does everybody have an auditing background, or are there some people that don't have auditing backgrounds?
Oh, there's a lot of people that don't have an auditing background.
Okay.
But we do have a lot of auditors amongst our experts, and I really like it, because they always pop the big question: is this really audible? Is this requirement really audible? And if you create audible standards, it's very important that you can actually audit from it. But we also have a lot of other experts from governments, from big quality departments all over the world, from different businesses. We also have teachers, we also have scientists, consultants, all kinds of experts, but also auditors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would also say that, well, depending on how big is the group and the governance, but usually the certification bodies and auditors have the same number of seats than the other ones. So their participation can be at a rate of, from 20 to 30%, depending on the composition of the groups. And also to add something to your previous questions, because I was thinking about something else, is usually, GFSI and also the CPOs are usually asked for volunteers also to, to provide technical input on guidelines or on case studies, because CPO like to illustrate their trainings through practical case studies, and they are really open to the feedbacks from auditors, and it's always better when the case studies are taken from real life and real issues from the floor.
And that leads me into a discussion of obviously one of the most important elements of any standardization in today's world is risk management, understanding of risk mitigation, especially in food safety. I mean, that's, risk is prevalent in any idea of how to manage quality and standardization, but risk in food is important. And, Karina talked a moment ago about, is something auditable? And I've always wondered about that. I mean, it's difficult to audit against something that's somewhat difficult to pin down. I mean, risk is kind of an amorphous, if that's the right word, thing to understand. For managers, for instance, who would be audited against the standard, they'd say, well, of course we understand risk. We understand the risks of what we do or what we don't do, but you need to be able to prove it. So how does an auditor contribute to a standard that would be able to pin down something that's hard to pin down, like risk?
And that's a key question, and I think it's connected to auditor competence, because a lot of standards are written in a generic wording, and then the reading or the interpretations will be product and process based, and that's why our auditor competence are key. And we expect, for example, an auditor who is going to audit a fish company to be approved, or to have a industry experience in the fish sector, to know the applicable legislation, so that he knows exactly before entering a company producing fish products, what are the basics when we are talking about personal hygiene, what are the basics when we are talking about the applicable legislation of the country of production, but also destinations, what are the requirements about temperature of the storage, and so on and so on. And that's why the auditor competence are really key, and this is defined well in ISO 22003, but also in GFSI requirements.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Karina, about risk?
I think that if you have a food business, if you produce food, it is your responsibility to set the right level of risk, to put in the measures that actually prevents the hazards from occurring, and to have the documentation that can actually convince the auditor to that the risk level is set right. I agree with Stephanie. It has a lot to do with competence of the auditors, but also it has a lot to do with documentation, and also actually to sometimes there's so much documentation that the auditors will never get through all the documents, but actually also to keep it simple and be pragmatic, and be able to use the tools in the risk assessment, so that you actually make a simple risk analysis that proves to the auditor that you've set the right level of risk. Because really the persons who knows most about the risk are the persons working in the business, hopefully, and that's why it's not up to the auditor to set the risk level. It's up to the auditor to audit the risk level set by the organization, but the responsibility is always the business, the food business.
Got it. We're talking kind of in the weeds, as we say now, a bit into the language, and question that just came to my mind is language, about language. Obviously we're talking about international standards, and no translation is ever perfect, right? I mean, you can't translate something exactly into French or Danish or English or simplified Chinese. So who does the translations, and how are the translations approved? Because that can change the shading of a meaning of a standard pretty significantly.
The translation, we mostly do the standards in English. And then ISO translates the documents into French, and then it's consolidated by the French national standardization body, AFNOR, that has the practical tools to do it. But you're right, translation can be a big problem. Also, when you set in the discussions and try to agree on the requirements, a lot of the argumentation can sometimes be, this cannot be translated into whatever, French or Spanish, and it's like, I'm like, it's not my problem. I want to have a requirement that is clear, that can be audited, and then the translation will be up to someone else. but it's actually very important that you can understand this in the same way in the different languages. And just if you just take an example like risk, also if you take risk into other sectors like quality and environmental, they have another understanding, a different understanding of how you do with risk. So yeah, language is really a big challenge, like cultures.
Yeah, and they kind of go hand in hand a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our session here. I'm talking to our users, so last chance to get in your final questions if you do have any folks, because we want to kind of wrap this up. So Stephanie, last words here, and if we get another question, I'll jump in here with it. But last words, what advice would you give people we have a fair number of people watching us today who are at the beginning of their careers. We have people all throughout their careers. But what advice would you give someone, not necessarily just in terms of getting involved in the process, but just in terms of building their career or career pathways? What advice would you give them in terms of developing this as their future career?
Well, I will tell them not to get discouraged about the different qualification process because there are many many requirements from the CPOs who are maybe different, and so sometimes they might feel it's challenging to get approved for fish for one CPO and not for another one. But they should be patient because I think GFSI is working a lot to try to harmonize this. And I think what I like in the food safety space is that we are with passionate people, and I think all this network do this job because they like it, and so I encourage them to continue with their passion and to try to also work on the continuous professional development to try to extend their knowledge to other scopes, because this is the benefits of the auditor pathway, that they can start with fish, but in the future they can get qualified for beverages, for oils and fats, and they can really expand their knowledge. So if people are curious and patient, I think it's a very nice career.
What would you say, Karina?
Well, I totally agree with Stephanie, especially on the patience, because some of these documents and processes, they mature over time. So you have to be very patient in order to gain the real understanding of it. Another thing is that I think that people should, in Danish we call it like nurse their network. So you have to be you really have to do something about your network. Always be curious and talk to people that you actually disagree with. Have a beer in the bar with the people that you actually don't understand, with the different cultures, with the different views, because over time you are actually able to bridge things that you really thought you couldn't. But you have to be very patient and very just a minute, I have to wave a colleague. Sorry.
As you just were saying, be engaging with people, right?
I got myself into the office for the first time in like a month. So I'm like, hey, everyone. But you have to nurture your network, really. And I think that will get you very, very far. And you have to look people into the eye and you have to smile.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. I very much appreciate that. I think that's wonderful. I think that's a great point to end this. Unfortunately, that is the time that we have here today. That's going to do it for us. I want to very much thank. I'm just going to get back up our slides here. I want to thank again Karina Delaguerre and Stephanie Lemaitre. And I'm sorry, I know I butchered your names, both of you, but I'm an American, so please forgive me. But I want to thank you both on behalf of Exemplar Global for joining us here at this live session. That was a lot of fun. I hope all of you out there got a lot of good information out of that. And again, if you have more questions, feel free to email us. Again, jboler, B-O-L-E-R, at exemplarglobal.org, and we'll get them to Karina and Stephanie. All right, before we go, I want to remind you all to please purchase your CPD certificate for this session. And a quick reminder, we have 2 more live sessions coming up next week here on the Food Safety Expo, and those are both going to be on the creative use of technology in food safety. They're scheduled for the 15th and 16th, depending on where you are in the world. Of course, we're doing these live. So the 15th, 16th, or even the 17th, I believe, from some parts of the world. So stay tuned for that. All right. Well, thanks to you all for joining us. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next time here at the Food Safety Expo. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.